Hey friends, I'm Johanna and I am really looking forward to this new series, Made, that we're about to walk through together. Here's some things you may not know about me. I read a ton of books. After high school, I went off to Africa for a few years and I love talking about stuff that really matters and is also kind of awkward, which is perfect for this new series that we're in, because we're going to be talking about sex. Now I know that after hearing this, a bunch of you want to crawl right under your seat and hide. You're probably thinking, really? Do we have to talk about this right now? A few of you are like, finally, something to talk about in church that's actually interesting. And some of you are like, gross. I don't want to hear some adult talk to me about sex in church. If that's you, don't worry. You get to talk about it in small group too. Now, I assume that most of you already know something about this topic because you've been educated by a teacher, a friend, a parent or older sibling, a movie or song, the internet, or even personal experience. So let's not act like I just brought up sex and that it's a topic none of you have ever thought about, talked about, or heard about before. Still, it might feel weird to talk about it in church, right? I get it. After all, isn't church the place where people tell you how wrong and evil it is? I mean, isn't this the place where you hear about all the things that you should stay far away from, sex being near the top of that list? Listen, if you feel that way, I get it. But I'm going to ask you to do just a couple of things tonight and throughout this series. Here's the first one. Relax. This conversation about sex is going to be different than you think. And it's not going to be super graphic or judgmental or even too awkward. It's just going to be different. So everybody just take a deep breath and relax. Second thing is this. Don't assume that you know what we're going to say. Just track with us and listen, please. That's all that we're asking. We promise we're not going to try to make people feel ashamed or grossed out. We just want to talk about something that we know is already being talked about in almost every other area of your life. That being said, I still get the idea that talking about sex in church is weird. In fact, maybe you put up your guard as soon as I mention the word because it's so confusing to talk about. If you grew up in church or in a Christian school, it may be especially awkward for you. It can be like an argument and there are two different sides. On one hand, many adults make it seem like sex is the worst sin you could ever commit. Culture, on the other hand, makes it seem like sex is the most casual thing ever. Watch one movie or listen to one hip-hop song and it's like, this isn't even a big deal. How can one topic have such extreme and opposite viewpoints? We'll talk a lot about that throughout this series, but to start out today, I simply want to make 2 points. First, God made sex. He invented it. So if you've ever wanted to have sex, or if you're curious about sex, God's not mad at you or ashamed of you. He understands hormones. Seriously, He made them, so He gets it. Second, God made you. Maybe that seems pretty basic or something you already know, but this is something we're going to talk about a lot in this series because the decisions that you make when it comes to sex are almost always connected to how you see you. That's why we're starting with this truth. God made you. In fact, Scripture says it this way. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Psalms 139. Don't skip over this. God did a good job when He made you, and He also did a good job when He invented sex. Which sounds nice, but the idea doesn't make the topic any less awkward or confusing, does it? And what do those two ideas have to do with each other anyway? That's where we're going to spend the rest of our time today. We're going to take a look at a passage of scripture in Matthew from one of the most popular speeches that Jesus ever gave called the Sermon on the Mount. At the time Jesus gave this message, He was starting to gain some popularity. He was teaching some really bold, challenging, and new things. But more than that, people were finding out that Jesus could heal people. So you can imagine the kinds of crowds that showed up when Jesus came to town. So everywhere that Jesus went, crowds followed Him. And this particular day, Jesus sits down on the side of a hill and He starts teaching them. He talks about how people should live and treat each other. And like He did with just about anything, Jesus was flipping the script on the way things had been viewed previously. He kept saying things like, you've heard it said, but I say. In other words, I know that you've always been taught about this, but I'm about to throw something completely new your way. And this is what Jesus said about sex. You have heard it was said, You shall not commit adultery. Now, the first part of that verse was important. You have heard it said, Jesus starts. People in the crowd would have been familiar with the 10 Commandments. So they would know the commandment number 7, you shall not commit adultery, meaning don't have sex with somebody else's husband or wife. Got it. Check. We're good on that one. But then Jesus adds something. And when he said what he said next, you better believe he shook things up. I imagine some people were like, I walked all the way out here to get my shoulder healed. I didn't show up to hear the adultery speech. What Jesus added had to do with more than just sex. He said, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This was different. To just say, don't commit adultery is saying, don't have sex before you're supposed to with someone you're not supposed to. That's all about our behavior, our actions, and our choices, things that we're doing on the outside. But then Jesus added what we look at and what we think about to the equation. In other words, Jesus expanded the definition of what sex is. In other words, up to this point, most people had a limited view of sex. Sex was an act, a behavior, and nothing more. But the problem is that there's more to it than that. When we see it only as an act or a behavior, and we leave out the thoughts that we think and the things that we look at, we're missing something. Now, why would Jesus bring up the issue of our hearts and what we think about when we're talking about a behavioral decision like sex? Because he cares about our hearts. This wasn't Jesus' way of saying, you thought God was just mad if you have sex, and I'm telling you he's mad at you for even thinking about it. No. This was Jesus' way of saying how you see the world and how you see each other will either make life better or worse for both of you, and I want more for you. Now, maybe you noticed that Jesus talked about looking at a woman lustfully. That's pretty specific. And maybe that sounds weird because it's not like people don't ever look at guys lustfully. Of course they do. But there was a reason he focused on women especially, because they lived in a culture that treated women as property, as objects. Women existed for men. They could be used and discarded. Their purpose was to have children, preferably boys, so the boys could carry on the family name. And outside of that, women were instructed to stay indoors and stay out of the way. So when Jesus says this about looking at a woman lustfully, he's making more than a statement about sex or thinking about sex. He's making a statement about how you see other people. He's addressing the way women should be viewed and treated. He's elevating their worth. So, this isn't just a sermon about avoiding sex. And it's not just a sermon to men about their hearts. It's a sermon about the way people view and treat people. See, sex doesn't start with our behavior. It starts with the value that we see in each other. And in our culture today, this is a reminder to guys and girls alike that people weren't made to be objects. You know what counts as an object? A Lunchable, a pair of headphones, a t-shirt, a Dunkin's iced coffee, maybe a math workbook. All of those are objects or products for you to consume. They're made for you to use, and then when you're done with them, they can be thrown away. And Jesus is saying, hey, people aren't in that category. In other words, objects are to be used and people are to be valued. Now think back on the verse from Psalms that we mentioned earlier. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well, which is in Psalms 139:14. Remembering that, doesn't it make sense that Jesus would care about the way that we look at each other? We're fearfully and wonderfully made, and looking at someone lustfully doesn't honor how they were made. It makes them an object. So of course Jesus would talk about more than just the act of sex, because we're fearfully and wonderfully made. Even our thoughts about other people should reflect that idea. So what does this mean for you? There's a great question to ask yourself when it comes to anything sex-related. Am I treating them like a product or a person? Will this make them an object in my mind or honor them? When you treat someone like an object or a product, it's all about you and what you want. Even if you don't mean to, you're using someone for your own enjoyment. But when you value someone, it's all about the other person and what's best for their future. For example, when you're tempted to ask someone to text you an inappropriate picture, ask yourself, am I using them or valuing them? When people are talking about someone in the locker room in an inappropriate way, and you're tempted to jump in, ask yourself, am I talking about them like someone I'd use or someone I value? When you're tempted to pressure your boyfriend or girlfriend to go further physically, ask yourself, am I using them or valuing their future? When you're tempted to go to websites where people are allowing themselves to be objectified, ask yourself, am I using this person like a product or valuing them like a person? Because people in porn videos are real people too. When you're tempted to do something sexual with somebody as a way to keep them interested in you and having a relationship with you, ask yourself, am I using them to get what I want or valuing what they want? When you're tempted to think about someone only in a sexual way, ask yourself, am I thinking about them like an object I use or a person I value? Again, you guys, this isn't about you having to stay away from something you want. God didn't make sex just to torture you. God made it specifically for the context of marriage, because marriage has the most potential for sex to be valuing and not objectifying. God places huge value on you, and He doesn't want you to be treated like an object. At the same time, He places huge value on others and doesn't want them to be treated as objects. He's not out to guilt you or shame you, but to remind you that all of us were made to be more than objects. And when we start seeing one another that way, we'll begin treating one another that way. And in turn, we'll make better decisions when it comes to sex and relationships. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. So is everybody else. So view each other as valuable, not as objects.